Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Glad you could make time. Merely a week and a day, are we a week and a day after the 2016 general elections? My name is Michelle Ranguette. I am the Assistant to the President for Politics, Labor, and Government Relations at AFT. And I'm delighted you could join us for this conversation. We're going to be a little bit informal today. Hopefully it will be a lot of dialogue. Hopefully we will be adding a lot of light and not heat to a situation that's already been very hot, I think, for many of us. And really want to dig in today and talk about the implications of this election on education policy in this country, recognizing that it's been sort of a stunning result on the national level, and it will have probably enormous implications for federal policy, but I don't want to miss the opportunity for us to spend some time really talking about and thinking about what's happened at the state level, because despite the very dramatic things we know are going to happen to our federal policy, the education department, the leadership in the country, and the work that so many of us have spent over the past couple years on ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Acts, and the work on student discipline, the work that's been done on reining in the for-profits, and looking at the potential for higher ed reauthorization in the future. I don't want us to forget to think about some of the real progress that has been made in the states in putting public education to voters directly and thinking about where citizens are, where communities are, and what that could mean and what opportunities there are in the future. So, with no further ado, I want to take a moment and introduce to you our panelists who are going to be in conversation. And then I want to go through just a couple of housekeeping items. So, first, to my left, we have Luis Huerta. And Luis is at Columbia University's Teachers College. He's an expert in school choice reforms and school finance policy, which I think will obviously be subjects in the days to come and very useful. Luis does not tweet, so I have no Twitter handle for him. And right now, having spent a lot of time on Twitter over the recent days, that might have been the best possible choice he could have made with his life. Moving on. To Luis's left, we have Catherine Brown, who's Vice President of Education Policy at the Center for American Progress. Catherine is a veteran of Teach for America. She's also worked for George Miller and also Secretary Clinton. So I'm sure Catherine will have a lot of insights on where we've been, where we're going, and we're looking forward to hearing from her. She tweets at CatBrown66 and also at AmProgress. And to Catherine's left, we have Frederick Hess, who is the resident scholar and director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author of a number of books and is also found on Twitter at RickHess99. And finally, at Rick's left, we have Randi Weingarten, who is president.
I am at your left.
I actually did not mean that, but I think that probably is somewhat subliminal. And Randi is president of the American Federation of Teachers, and I think many of you are no stranger to her work here. So, before we get started, I want to just take a moment to let you know that if you are trying to capture this with your own thoughts live, or if you have questions for us, please tweet this at hashtag 2016education. You can also tag AFT Union or Shanker Institute. It's at Shanker Institute. Yeah. And we also invite you, we're going to make time certainly for questions toward the end. So, please take notes and capture your questions as we go along. And finally, I want to make sure that as you came in, you took note of an invitation to a conference that we will be holding on Monday, December 5th, called The Challenge of Precarious Labor. I think today we're probably thinking that labor is possibly more precarious than it's ever been, so this should be an interesting conference. So make sure if you didn't grab this flyer on your way in, that you grab one on the way out. But this, the first of the Shanker series of this calendar year, I'm happy to present, so why don't we just get started? And I want to open it up by asking Luis on my left to give us some of his opening thoughts about this election and its implications on education policy.
Thanks, Michelle. And thank you to Leo for organizing this and for inviting me. So when Leo invited me, obviously the invitation came before the election. So we had a little bit of a conversation on what we were going to talk about. But then the election happened. And then I was scratching my head thinking, well, what are we going to talk about? So fortunate for me, at least, that one of the few things that is written down and not out in the ether insofar as lack of clarity is the choice policies that Trump has talked about and that are still existent in his website, at least for this week. And they haven't changed as far as I know between pre and post election. But as you've all read, the choice policy that has been espoused and it appears to be the central piece of his agenda is the idea of expanding vouchers and that the Fed level would expand vouchers. We need to remember that this has been tried over and over many times, even from Reagan to present, and the Fed level involvement in the expansion of vouchers has failed consistently, not just for vouchers, but tuition tax credits as well. The Fed level's role really in the choice programs has really been more on expanding charter schools and providing funding and so forth. But on the voucher piece, as we've read, he's proposing a $20 billion injection from the Fed. It's not clear where this money is going to come from, whether it's coming from Title I, whether it's coming from some other allocation. And this sort of matched grant or incentive to try to get states to pitch in another 110 or $100 billion, which would amount, and I haven't done the math, but this is Trump's math, and that would amount to about $12K per kid of a voucher that would presumably capture all low income or kids in failing schools. Again, I haven't gone back to try to even start doing the math and where some of these numbers are coming from, but that's actually that's the proposal. I think it's important to put that sort of proposal in context of what we know from the evidence. The evidence on not just on vouchers, on charter schools, tuition tax credits, and other choice programs. We've had 25 years of charter schools, 26 years of vouchers, tuition tax credits, about 6,800 kids in charter schools. I'm sorry, 6,800 schools, about 3 million kids. We have about 50 different types of voucher, tuition tax credit, and education savings grants programs currently. About 300K students participating in those. So 25 years and a substantial amount of kids. But the evidence insofar as whether kids in charter schools and or kids in voucher schools are doing better than kids in traditional schools is still fairly mixed. And I think there's some important lessons from the folks who have been doing the research, especially on the voucher side. Lessons that are very specific to the conclusions, and that is that the evidence is not only mixed, but it's quite uneven. And there isn't any experiment, at least on the voucher, the privatization side, that has conclusively shown that kids who take up vouchers and go to private schools are doing better. And this is really important to remember because we're going to hear a lot. We're going to hear a lot about the so-called gold standard research, I think, in the next few months. Let's not confuse gold standard with, somehow equating that with fact insofar as evidence that kids have taken up vouchers are doing better. The very researchers of some of these so-called gold standard research studies have themselves concluded and have warned about the implications of using some of their conclusions to draw policy from, because they are so uneven. And I can go into more detail if you like, but I want to be brief on my opening statement. On the charter school side, we've seen a little bit more positive evidence on some charter studies in places like New York and other places. But again, we're talking about 25 years of charter schools with very still weak evidence for the most part. And I think predicating an entire federal agenda on school choice is potentially problematic, because we can probably get more bang for our buck in addressing the needs of our low-income and neediest kids through other programs. And the idea of risking and promoting a program that is grounded on market choice I think has some pretty profound implications.
Thank you. Thank you. And turning it over to Catherine, do you want to pick up on that?
Sure. I certainly agree with the concerns that you raised about choice programs, and I also agree that that will likely be a very high priority for the Trump administration, though I want to underscore that I think a lot is very uncertain at this point. Just to state the obvious.
Not treated as obvious, Reverend, so it's good you say.
Yeah, well, anyway, I think the big takeaway from the election is the Republicans won big. This pains me to say this. I represent the Center for American Progress. We're a progressive think tank, and there's just no way to sugarcoat it. The Republicans now have complete control in 26 states. They took Iowa and Kentucky. They now control both houses of the legislature as well as the governor. There's only 6 states where Democrats are in charge. There are 33 states with Republican governors. This is the highest number of states with Republican governors in history. Republicans now have greater control of our democracies at the state level at any year since 1932. I do think there is a lot of work to do in terms of listening and learning, and I think we're still at the early stages of thinking through what that means, but there's no way to look at these results without concluding that. There were some good things that came out from a progressive standpoint that I would like to point out. There were 4 states that voted to increase the minimum wage, and 1 state that actually voted to reject a decrease in the minimum wage. So this was a really good night for the minimum wage. Even in states that elected governors to their legislatures and to their governors, they voted to increase the minimum wage, which is great. There were 3 wins for gun control advocates in California, Nevada, and Washington. They voted for gun control. 2 states voted for guaranteed paid sick leave, which is such an important benefit for working families. And democracy and transparency had a good night. There were a bunch of different ballot initiatives to provide more transparency, to limit contributions to political campaigns, and all of those were very successful. And 3 states voted for marijuana to be legalized. So for those that are really struggling with this election, you now have a place to go. In terms of education, I think...
Wait, was it recreational?
2 states were recreational, 1 was medical. Yeah, I read closely. From an education standpoint, June Atkinson lost the state superintendent in North Carolina. This was a surprise. Massachusetts obviously rejected the charter school expansion. And then in terms of the takeaways, as I see them from the federal perspective, I think, again, a lot is unknown. As was just discussed, Trump's main proposal was this $20 billion voucher program coupled with $110 billion from the states, but totally unclear where that money would come from. And I think that we should probably treat that as not a real proposal. And then he also proposed to do away with the Department of Education, which would require the Congress to act, which I think is also not a real proposal. My takeaway is that, this is an original thought, this has also been written many times, but I think Trump doesn't really care that much about education. I don't expect this to be a huge priority for his administration, so we can probably think about what the Republicans on the Hill view as their priorities as likely to be his priorities, but it will largely be determined, I think, when we have a better sense of the secretary and the personnel that he's putting in the department. I do think local control is, we were on a slow-moving train or moderately fast-moving train towards local control. It was codified in ESSA, and now we are on a bullet train towards local control. So I think states and largely states, to some degree districts, I think we should all worry a bit about state capacity, especially around accountability systems and how they're actually going to be able to use this local control. But there's no question they're in the driver's seats that ESSA really codified a lot of restraints around the Department of Education in terms of what kind of regulations they could promulgate and what kind of powers they would have. There's some irony in that now. I think the Hill Republicans assumed that it would be President Hillary Clinton whose hands they were constraining, and now they've constrained their own. But regardless, that's where it is. The other policy that Trump talked a lot about was Common Core and how he was going to repeal the Common Core. That is, sort of a nonsensical policy because the federal government didn't put the Common Core in place in the first place and doesn't control it now and can no further do away with it, then they would have to force states to do away with it. So I think we can just put that over here and just assume that was rhetoric, like a lot of the things Trump said. And then the last thing I'll mention is I think with Trump's case action suit coming up against him for Trump University and his ownership of Trump, University, I'll say that in quotes, I think, and the Republican general support of free markets, and I think online schools is probably something they're expanding rapidly. They tend to be enrolling students who are disadvantaged, not doing well, and their outcomes are very poor, and I'm very worried that there will be even more pressure, even more support for these kind of schools, and probably more likely much less oversight than I think we would have seen in Secretary Clinton's administration. And so this is just one area where we're going to be watching closely, and it'll probably be a problem both in the K-12 space and in the higher ed space. Rick?